some live presenters. And also we every day we try to show a video with students' experiences too, because we know the experiences of individuals, even if they have the same disability, varied immensely by the other different identities, by their location, where they are, background information, etc. So if we met one student with disability, we just met one student with disability, and the same is true to so many other identities. So we want to expand our understanding of different narratives and different experiences. So sharing about what we were trying to find videos that have diverse representations and diverse in terms of all kinds of social identities. It's really very hard to come up with very diverse in terms of race, etc. But we found this video that we thought it was important to share. It's a 10-minute video. It comes from Stanford Neurodiversity Project. It was done by students, for students and for colleagues. The caveat on this video is that was done to accommodate neurodiverse students in dorms. So the video is about designing inclusive dorm communities. And we watch it, and it totally applies to designing inclusive classroom communities. The content really applies. It has, and now I'm mindful because I'm looking for, here, Rocco. It has something that Rocco couldn't benefit from, having a visual disability, which is something we like, and these are the decisions we need to make. How are we going to accommodate? It has action items. As the video goes, there is a bubble, a square that says action item, and there is no sound to that. So that is something that Rocco, for instance, couldn't benefit from. And in that case, we'll talk about, so what will I do? I will watch it ahead of time, type the action items, and share with the student ahead of time that there is text that they're going to miss. Okay, so let me share it with you. Share screen.
My name is Isabelle, and I am a senior about to graduate, majoring in psychology with a specialization in health and development, and I am autistic. My freshman year, I was in Cedro, so it was Wilbur dining. We just had a table, like a long table that we sat out for meals. I mean, it wasn't compulsory, but the RAs, I don't know, I think that was their way of like community building. Like, we're gonna sit at this table. It just means that there's a lot of people close to you because there's not a whole lot of space, and everyone's talking across, and there's just a lot of things that I would only go to like my dining hall because I didn't want to, like, even just like a new layout, like I would just kind of wander around and like be really overwhelmed. So I like do the same thing every day, like have my routine. But I felt like, okay, I guess I should be social and talk to people maybe, even though I didn't like it. Pretty quickly I realized I was just going to sit in the corner by myself and eat my food and get out of there. Because of like sensory things, I can kind of get pushed into like a meltdown because I can't like escape the bad sensory input. I had a really bad interaction my freshman year during NSO with RAs who decided things were a crisis and everyone got less and less and less information, and then they couldn't make decisions, and so then no one listened to me, and I was like, this is ridiculous, you can't make decisions or listen to me. The biggest thing is the lack of information. Once you tell the people, this is what is likely to happen, this is what I need in those instances, here's how you can help me, here's what you do not do, everyone's been super on board with it, my RFs, everyone. But without that information, they're going to assume whatever they've been given in training. And so if they haven't been trained in anything related to neurodiversity, if someone's crying and biting their hands and is not responding to you verbally, that looks really scary, understandably. But I haven't had experience where I've like explained this to an RA and then had them not respond positively. Taking away some of the like imposition on the neurodiverse person to have that conversation, like it wasn't a comfortable experience for me. Like I was probably pretty like anxious, like sitting through this meeting, knowing like, okay, I'm gonna go talk to my RA. Like, I had emailed him before and asked to like set up a meeting. But if there's like more awareness about that, or even like RA is just saying like creating an environment, it's like, hey, if you have things you want to tell us, or fill out this form, and that can be a way to facilitate those conversations, especially if you don't realize that that might be a good thing to do ahead of time.
I was wondering if there were any like structured dorm activities that were helpful.
I pick and choose. Like if there is an activity that is not necessarily just social based, like there are other humans around, but trivia, you're just asking me a question and I'm like writing my own answers down. I don't really, there's not a whole lot of crosstalk happening, but you still get that like social interaction and like laughing about things that you're end up like you accidentally have a conversation rather than the point of being a conversation. And so there are things that RAs are already doing, but I think like being really intentional about that is like a good thing to keep in mind.
My name is Anna Krakowski. I'm a senior majoring in English. I'm from New York. Yeah, and I suppose I have chronic pain and I have depression with psychotic symptoms. Also anxiety nonspecific and or PTSD.
I did at one point tell my RA, like at least one of my RAs, a lot of the things I was going through, and she tried to be helpful with like, she's like, I'm really sorry you're going through like physical and mental health challenges. I don't know entirely what the best protocol is for learning how to approach someone with trauma, because trauma can be so different for each person. But I think one thing that I did learn that I thought was useful that I learned in a class that I took was compassionate humility, where you're willing to put yourself out there and try and say something and ask questions and try and provide support in whatever way you think is right, but you're always willing to admit that you might be wrong about what's right at that moment. And it focuses a lot on being bolder and being willing to offer support, even if you realize it's the wrong way that you offered support in the first place. Just, it's good to offer that support. I do wish there had been more conversation about mental health in general around orientation or just openly in the dorm, or information about how to access mental health, programming around mental health, things like that.
You just heard from neurodivergent Stanford students with different experiences in the dorm and different perspectives on how the dorms could have created spaces where they could better thrive. The term neurodiversity basically means that individuals with differences in brain functions are thought of as part of normal human variation. I hope that you appreciate the differences in these perspectives, but also take away some key commonalities. First, the typical dorm community can be really isolating for people who identify as neurodivergent or neurodiverse. Some common challenges of neurodiverse conditions include social anxiety and social unawareness, sensory sensitivities, and tics and repetitive behaviors. These social, sensory, and behavioral challenges can make crowds, loud noises, and implicit judgment by others difficult. Unfortunately, these barriers often exist at common dorm activities and in dining hall interactions, limiting residents' engagement in the community. Second, there are specific ways you can help. One of them is providing alternative modes of communication that lessen the social and sensory barriers. For residents who struggle with in-person dialogue, putting information in emails and group chats can help them stay connected. Another way to help is to explicitly normalize and welcome residents coming forward with any challenges they have. For example, for residents with ADHD, that could include maintaining the attention necessary to complete assignments, or struggling to navigate handling the new responsibilities that come along with college. Speaking more broadly now, designing social events with neurodivergent residents in mind can be an amazing way to expand and enrich the dorm community. When you think about neurodiversity, I encourage you to frame it in terms of strengths, not deficits. People have many types of intelligence. And for some neurodiverse people, even though they're not adept in some areas of intelligence, they really excel in others. That same concept of having areas where you're more skilled and more challenged is true for every person. So when you talk to your residents and help them through challenges, make sure you focus on the areas of strength and how they can leverage them. You might be curious, how do you know if a neurodivergent student is in your dorm so that you know what to look out for and to accommodate them? This is tricky. First, because you shouldn't pressure anyone to disclose their conditions. And secondly, because a lot of neurodivergent students don't have a formal diagnosis. But if you take concepts of inclusivity to heart, it shouldn't actually matter if you know whether someone in your dorm is neurodivergent or not. You should design activities and communities that will allow everyone to participate and play off their strengths. New residents coming to campus will have to deal with signing up for classes, finding clubs to get involved with in an overwhelming activities fair, and navigating new social relationships with strangers. All of this can be very challenging, not just for people with neurodiverse conditions. For you to universally design a welcoming dorm experience, we encourage you to have the following practices right from the beginning of the year. Try not to put the burden on the neurodivergent or neurodiverse student to come forward to you. Make it clear that you're open to talking about any types of challenges, in whatever mode of communication they're most comfortable with. Some in-person meetings may seem required to you for building community. Ask yourself if they are as universally accessible as possible. Consider that some people are more comfortable with texting and written communication. Can you provide that as an alternative to having to be there in person or having to share something verbally in front of everyone? Think about establishing dorm norms so that it's not just you and dorm staff who are being accessible. Can it be a priority for the whole dorm to be universally inclusive, minimizing barriers of social interaction and sensory or physical challenges? With those practices in mind, we've provided several handouts for you to get more in-depth resources that will be useful when you're thinking about neurodiversity. Mental health is really important to consider in the neurodivergent population. Since social inclusivity is key to mental health, the dorm community can make a big impact in this area. We've also given you a handout on universal design, which goes more in depth with some of the inclusivity practices we talked about. This handout provides a checklist to help you design your events and communities in an inclusive way. Finally, please discuss and reflect on these questions with the rest of your staff. First, how will you incorporate neurodiversity in the design of your dorm events? And secondly, how can the changes you make also improve the experiences of neurotypical residents? Thank you for your time and attention, and for your interest in learning more about neurodiversity.
I was muted. We are so glad to have Cheryl Burgstaller.
Bergstaller.
Bergstaller
Bergstaller. Very German. Can't you tell? I look so German.
with us today. It's really phenomenal. Cheryl has been a leader in the field of universal design since I remember when I was at the Institute on Disabilities in 1991 and 2. I heard of Cheryl really doing phenomenal work at the University of Washington with the Do It project. And when we heard that she recently wrote a book on universal design for learning in higher education, we asked her if she would be willing to share with us some of her knowledge and also tips on how can we create more universally designed inclusive classrooms. So we are delighted that she agreed to do this, and here she is.
Here I am. Yeah, through the wonders of technology. One of the silver linings of the pandemic is that we can get together like this. I mean, you're in Pennsylvania, I'm here in Seattle. Another sunny day in Seattle, like you always hear about, right? We do have rain, but not a lot of rain, particularly this time of the year. So anyway, I'm really happy to join you. I was actually looking at your website, and I would like to come. If I came in person, I'd be able to go to that Gray Towers Castle. Is it like as cool as it looks on screen? I do visit a lot of campuses, usually in person until the pandemic, and I missed that part of it, although I don't miss the travel. Yeah, so anyway, so here I am. So I'm at your disposal here, and I'm giving let's go up about 10,000 feet here and kind of look at the idea of what we're doing, and I'll give examples throughout. But you're getting so many good on the ground examples that's a great part and the good important work that's getting done here. But it's also good to think, now, what approach are we talking about here? And so that's kind of the angle that I'm taking. So how can we reach inclusive excellence by applying universal design in higher education? I go by she and her pronouns. I sitting in a part of the panel that was just on. I love going right after the student panel, and the idea of, well, gee, what for visually impaired students, what should I describe? And there's kind of a tendency these days to over describe, I think, and I think that one of the past students pointed that out, actually, and I'm of that feeling too. And some people would say, I have blonde hair and I have a yellow blouse on today and so forth. I'm not opposed to that. But I think that the most important rule about visual description is to say what's important about your talk. And it's personal decision. Right now, if I was wearing a clown suit, I would describe that, because that would be something unusual. But there's nothing unusual about the way I look here. And people who are blind, if I'm at a regular conference, they can't see me either. So, but I will point out things in this presentation, which you'll see. And unless I goof up here, I'm going to describe all of the visual content that's presented. And so everyone gets a sense of what we're covering. The way I do that, by the way, is just a handy little hint. I always assume when I'm giving a talk, like right this minute, that someone could not get the visual and they're just dialing in with their smartphone. And so they're just listening to what I'm saying. And so my goal is that they can fully understand what I'm talking about. Yes, they will miss some of the cute little visuals I'm going to show, but they're not going to miss any of the content. So I run two units at the University of Washington as part of Accessible Technology Services, the IT accessibility team since 1984. It's been called a lot of different names, but it's focused on making sure that the staff and faculty and students and visitors at our campus have access to anything that we offer that involves digital technology. And so our websites and so forth. So that's one thing that I do. But back in the 90s, I decided I wanted to take more of a holistic approach. It's not just about technology, because in that IT accessibility team role, we're about accessible technology for individuals with disabilities, but also for English language learners, for people using their smartphones instead of a regular computer screen and so forth. It's not just about disability. I wanted to do more of that. And I wanted to take more of a holistic view. And my background is in mathematics and computer science instruction, but at the middle school, high school, and college and university levels. And so I'm really interested in child development and a lot of things that are beyond technology. And so I started the Do It Center in 1992, funded by the National Science Foundation, and have been supported in this part of my work with federal, state, corporate, and private funds. As has been mentioned, we've been around a long time, 1992, and I'm proud to say we've managed to get continual funding all that time from NSF, but Department of Education, and whoever will give us money to do the things that we want to do. And so we develop a lot of resources, and it was mentioned, I just wrote another book that I'll mention at the end, and we just try to get resources out there to improve the lives of people with disabilities and help them reach the success that they're capable of in college, careers, and all other adult life experiences. We have a Do It Center in Japan as well that started in 2007. You might want to look that up, although it's all in Japanese on the web. And the Center on Universal Design and Education since 1999, which is kind of where this particular presentation comes from, that angle. Well, I like to take a look at our model. We take an individual-centered community building model with key stakeholders. So the two words that are stakeholders and community building are important. Any problem we're trying to solve, like in this case, in the center of this wheel that's on the screen, it says success of people with disabilities in academics and careers. That's our primary focus for the Do It Center, and more narrowly with the IT Accessibility Center. So the first group here, as far as a stakeholder, is people with disabilities. We can't ignore people with disabilities. I love to go right after the panel, by the way. So we need to center the voices of people with disabilities and their experiences, no doubt. And they have a role to play in self-determination and so forth in their success. Other stakeholders include family members and peers and near peers, mentors, allies, professional organizations like the Disability Services Office, broadening participation efforts around the country, post-secondary administrators, faculty, staff, service providers. That's the group I'm talking to today. And so I'm tailoring my words to that group at your institution. Employers, technology companies. We help Microsoft make their products more accessible, Google, Facebook. We work with Zoom because we adopted Zoom years ago at our institution, and my team had lobbied against it because it was so inaccessible. And so our team has been working with Zoom for many years and making it the most accessible product for conferencing on the planet. And I already made a note of a comment that was made in this last session, because we're in almost daily contact with that company to continue to push for more accessibility. And so features are being added all the time. Legislators, policymakers, and even funding agencies to fund projects in broadening participation of people with disabilities in careers, like they do for women and racial ethnic minorities and other underrepresented groups. And my comment at the bottom of the screen, some stakeholders are just not doing their share. And some faculty, in the case of talking today, is sometimes you think your share may be nothing because the Disability Services Office does everything, or you listen to a panel like we've just listened to, you think, oh my gosh, I've got to become an expert on this. I need to have workshops and learn definitions of different disabilities and so forth. And hopefully universal design will kind of simplify that focus for you a bit. So when we're working with students, we're working to promote self-determination, which is a broad term, and developing the skills and knowledge, the technology, the resources, whatever you need to be successful. And as came up in the panel, when it's post-secondary education, a lot of the effort is on the part of a student with a disability who sometimes isn't very adequately prepared to lobby for themselves. And so we need to work on that. But that's another part of our organization. We just finished a 3-week online program for teens with disabilities to help them get ready for college and careers. When we are working with faculty, though, and staff and institutions, technology companies, whatever, all those other people, we're talking about universal design. And that's what I'm talking about today. So exactly what is it? So when we look at an inclusive environment like your campus and like our campus, this is the way I think about it. Whoever meets the requirements with or without accommodations is encouraged to participate. So in your class, everyone's encouraged to participate, feels welcome. If a student encounters your syllabus and it's not accessible to them, I'll tell you one thing, they're not feeling welcome. If your introductory video saying, hi, welcome you to my class is not captioned, if a student needs captions, they are not feeling welcome to your class. So part of what we're talking about in your whole program here is how do we make students with disabilities even welcome in your classes? In the day of the pandemic now, many students with disabilities have dropped out of higher education because they aren't convinced that the courses they're going to take online will be accessible to them. And fortunately, they're right. So make sure that everyone's fully engaged in accessible and inclusive environments and activities. So we don't have to have a lot of special, oh, you can do an alternative assignment, or you can do this instead. We try to avoid that. How can we make it more inclusive? So our goal is really is a paradigm shift on our campuses, yours and ours, almost every campus in the country, frankly. A paradigm we can think of as a theory or a group of ideas about how we do something, or how something is done, whatever. And the dominant paradigm is a collection of values or a system of thought in a society or an organization that's widely held at a given time. It provides an almost unconscious, internalized framework that affects the way people think things should be done and often goes without question. So I guess I'm actually promoting this idea of all of us to kind of think differently about accessibility, about students with disabilities, about the role of the Disability Services Office, about our role as faculty. And I do teach online myself, and also hybrid classes. And so I'm a big advocate of how we can make our online programs accessible, but a hybrid version is great because I think there are advantages online and there are advantages in person. But different issues come into play for all of our students. So we want to go from a reactive reliance on accommodations alone to a proactive universal design of accessible, inclusive, sustainable products. So we don't have to go back and retrofit everything like our documents. We have to fix those videos later on. How can we make them right so that they're born accessible? And then we want to look at our environment itself and see how inclusive that is. We want to go from the design for the average to the thinking of, well, let's see, the average student in my class is, you know, early 20s and blah, blah, blah. That's good. Nothing wrong with thinking about the average student, but universal design helps us to think about the range of abilities and interests and backgrounds of our students. Once upon a time, we already did it, frankly. You did it at your campus and we did. Our campuses are very old. We have old buildings. And it was back in 1970s, early 70s, when we promoted, many people promoted curb cuts and sidewalks. And there's an image on the screen right now that is a picture that was on the front page of Our Daily, which is our student newspaper here at the University of Washington. 1970, it says, "Ramp the curbs, get me off the street," on the back of a wheelchair of a young man who couldn't get on our sidewalks. He was going around on the streets and trying to get into buildings that weren't very accessible and so forth. Many people pushed back on them. It is not reasonable for us to put curb cuts on all the sidewalks for a few people on our campus who are using wheelchairs. It's just not financially feasible. Well, we know all of that has changed, and people developing sidewalks these days, it's just part of standard design to put these little ramps or curb cuts in the sidewalk. And now they even add some bumps. So a person that's using a cane, a person who's blind, can actually see that they're kind of getting onto a street. It's kind of a nice feature when you think about it. And those curb cuts, by the way, aren't primarily used by people in wheelchairs. They're by people that are pushing baby strollers or delivery carts or a skateboarder here and there. They're for everyone. It improves the design. It's not about lowering standards. And so a framework that I propose, that I'll just present briefly here, but is in this book we were talking about, but also on our website. So you don't have to buy the book to get much of this, is the scope. Think about everything that you're doing on your campus and figure out what is your definition of universal design. We'll talk about today. And what principles are existing? And there are many principles and there are guidelines and practices. Some of them have been tested. Some of them have a lot of anecdotal information to support them. And then the process of universal design. How do we do this in our courses particularly? So when you look at the scope, it could be just instruction. Your focus is on that in your program. But I had challenged you to take a little broader perspective on that and think about services, the technology you purchase, like your conferencing software that I just mentioned with Zoom, in making sure it's accessible. But if it's not, working with that company, we got contract wording in that Zoom procurement that said they had to work with my team. And take greater steps towards accessibility. And they did. And they took us up on our offer to use our resources to help them make their products better. Physical spaces, projects, conference exhibits, presentations like today, a presentation thinking, what does universal design mean? I already told you one tip is to speak all the content on your screen. By the way, that encourages you not to have too much content on your screen. Some people will put images of websites and so forth, a lot of tiny text. Nobody can read that. You don't want them reading that. You want them listening to you. And so the presentation should be a summary of what you're presenting. But then your resources at the end can point to the more detailed things that you do want people to read. But that's going to take some time. And don't encourage people to read and listen to you at the same time. So what's the scope? Well, we take a look at the students. Who are we talking about? Variation, diverse characteristics regarding what? Well, race, ethnicity, cultural background, sexual identity, socioeconomic level, age, marital status, religious beliefs, values, academic interests, work experience, and specific abilities. For you to be an expert on some of these groups like ethnicity and race and people with disabilities and so forth, you can be that, but that's probably a different career field for you. But you also can do things that remarkably can help all of these groups through the practice of universal design. It was mentioned in the panel about when universal design was mentioned, that some of the stuff we're talking about benefits other people. And I had mentioned for individuals with visual impairments, me speaking the content benefits them, but it also benefits that are people that are dialing in, English language learners, and many other people who benefit from hearing, listening to the same, listening and viewing at the same time the words on the screen. Somebody who's in charge of the Disability Services Office better know a lot about disabilities, definitions, diagnosis, how to review professional documentation about a disability that can support specific accommodations. Most of us are not in that category. And there, I think it's more important to focus on ability rather than disability. I mean, really, isn't it important the abilities our students have, not so much their disabilities? And when it comes to ability, any individual ability, we're all on a continuum. Everyone in this room, in this Zoom room right now, could rate themselves. You could spend all the time and rate yourself from not able on the left of this arrow, double-edged arrow, to very able on the right-hand side. And we could start with things like understanding English. Some of you might put yourself a little low in this category because English is not your first language. It could be because you have a disability that impacts your ability to understand English. The point being that an ability rating is not just about disability. Your ability is impacted by many things, and particularly in specific settings. Second one on here is social norms. Again, you might rate yourself low on this because you have a disability that really impacts your ability to kind of pick up social cues. You have to be taught more than maybe the average student, if you want to call it that. And it could also be because you live in a different culture than the dominant one of the professor. So it's a disability related thing or not. The ability to see or hear or walk, the ability to read print, to write with a pen or a pencil, to communicate verbally, to tune out distraction, to learn, to manage physical and mental health. We could rate all of these. And if we turned in this assignment, none of us would have the same combined rating, which says that there is no average really person. There are averages of each one of these abilities, but there's no like average person, probably very few on the planet for any time when we would be rating all these things. A couple of other things that are worth noting. Most disabilities are not obvious. And they're less obvious online than they are in an on-site setting. And so don't assume that you don't have students with disabilities in your class because you don't notice that you have any. But also you can't assume that you have disabilities represented in your class by the letter you get from Disability Services saying what the accepted accommodations are. Nationwide, fewer than 1/3 of students with disabilities report them to the Disability Services Office. And so faculty members don't learn about those disabilities. And some students will report them to the office, but not give permission to that office to share them with faculty, specifically individual faculty, because that's their prerogative. Why don't they disclose them? Well, you know, it's for a lot of reasons. It's a personal decision. But what we hear from the students in our programs, like we just had in the last 3 weeks, is they're often reluctant to share an invisible disability, such as dyslexia or someone on the autism spectrum or mental illness, because they're worried about the prejudice of faculty. They're concerned that the faculty members will treat them differently and not treat them fairly. And in some cases, that's true. But it's unfortunate, but it's important for us to know, tuck that away, that there are students in your class with disabilities that could benefit from accommodations, but are afraid to ask for them. And so universal design, as you'll see, reaches those students and the students that don't report them to the office at all. And so the disability is not known to you, but universal design reaches those students as well. And then the Disability Services Office, as they're designed on most of our campuses, are set up to provide accommodations for individuals. So they're serving individual students. Their role gets into play when your courses or student services or a facility is not already accessible and inclusive of a person with that type of disability. So universal design, anyway, lobbies for, well, how can we build in some of these features to reduce the number of accommodations? There's nothing wrong with accommodations, but my feeling is that we just use them too often when altering the environment, the facility, the course would be a better use of our money, and it would make the experience more useful for a student with disabilities, because keep in mind, often the accommodation comes after whatever's happening with the rest of the class. If your syllabus is not accessible to someone, that student services office has to make it accessible for that student, and maybe it will get delayed and they won't get the syllabus with other students. That's kind of a disadvantage. I think it's kind of a mean trick, actually, for a student not to be able to read the syllabus and view my introductory video on the first day that they enter my class. It's important to consider intersectionality as well. And that even complicates things. You know, a student with a disability isn't one-dimensional. First of all, many have multiple disabilities, but also many are part of other underserved populations. So, and those different identities interact with one another. So that makes things kind of complicated. Now in this next part, in the rest of this talk, we're talking about, okay, so what can we do about it as a faculty member? We can't interview every one of our students to talk about their disabilities. For one thing, they may not want to talk about their disability to you. And but let's think about for a minute, what are the most common accommodations in online classes right now during the pandemic? We've seen a great increase in two expensive accommodations. One is adjusting your documents to reformat inaccessible documents, which tend to be PDFs, because PDF format is more difficult to make accessible when compared to Microsoft Word, when compared to just adding content in your learning management system, which is HTML, the language of the web, used on websites. We're spending a lot of time, and I hear about this from Disability Services Office nationwide. And captioning videos. And some faculty say, oh, no problem here, because I use YouTube and I point them to YouTube and they have captions. Well, if you've looked at many YouTube videos, those captions aren't very accurate. And so you need to remember they were created by a computer, and they did a pretty good job for a computer, I think, in most cases, but they don't get the punctuation. They misspell words. And that's another mean trick for someone who has to rely on captions if the words aren't spelled right. Also a mean trick for English language learners who want to learn the correct spelling of a word. So what is universal design? I like to use the very basic definition. There are others out there. That's a nice thing about definitions, right? There are just many to choose from, but you can go back to the basics. Universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people. It's not just about people with disabilities, to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. We can never fully reach the universal design of everything, but when we're building something, even a microwave oven, shouldn't we think about the diverse population that might be using that oven, including elderly people that have limited sight, making the characters larger and so forth, and also maybe having the beep adjustable so you can make it quite loud. I mean, just universal design can be applied to everything, including your courses. This is from the Center on Universal Design at North Carolina State University. So universal design, as I mentioned, provides inclusive access. And that's what's very important about universal design. It's not just about accessible access. On the screen right now is a picture of one of the entrances to our buildings at the University of Washington. 2 steps going in the main entrance, and on the left-hand side, a very ADA compliant ramp with side rails, handrails that goes up to the entrance. So a very typical way to make a building accessible. The second image I'm putting up now is another building, and it's actually an older building. And it has a sloping ramp into the building, quite long ramp, and it's very wide. If you look at image 1, and I'm walking into that building with a wheelchair user, we part ways, and that person goes up the ramp and I go up the steps, because the ramp is too narrow for me to walk side by side. So our conversation is interrupted. On the right-hand side, we would go down this ramp together and go in the entrance together. And it's wide enough so if someone else is passing us from the other direction, they can go that direction. So the primary thing we're offering in the physical environment is the one that's most accessible and usable and inclusive. The inclusive part is what I'm emphasizing here. Because on the left, that is totally accessible, ADA compliant, usable design, no doubt, I'm not arguing that. But universal design it takes us to a little higher calling. There are plenty of steps in that building, by the way. So if you want to take the steps, you can, but it's not the main entrance. And that's what we're doing with our classes. And universal design, as I mentioned, benefits everybody, or just about everybody anyway. And so if we have accurate captions on our videos, it's useful certainly to someone who requires them because they cannot hear the audio. But English language learners really benefit from captions. If we're in a noisy environment like the airport, or a really quiet environment like a baby's room when the baby's sleeping, we like to turn off the noise, and then we can just have our captions and follow the video. I can watch a YouTube video and my husband's watching a sports game on TV at the same time in the same room. Just turn off my volume. Because people that want to know the spelling of the words, isn't that pretty much everyone? And if we want to find the content quickly, it is possible to search those captions to look at a collection of videos and to find content on a specific topic. So if we take a look at our smartphones, the smartphone builds in accessibility features, white on black, black on white, larger characters. It can talk to us. My phone talks to me way too much. I can hardly get to shut up. But we build in these features that used to be assistive technology that people with disabilities tacked onto their computer. Not anymore. It's built in. Why? Because many of us benefit from these features who don't consider ourselves having a disability. We just can't see that tiny little print. And it ensures compatibility with assistive technology. So you kind of have to know what assistive technology students with disabilities might be using, kind of in a general way, not in a specific way. Again, there are like thousands of assistive technologies. You probably aren't going to become an expert on that, although it's really fascinating, the different ways people can use computers. But they do have some implications as far as the design of what you're offering, particularly online. And so universal design actually rests on 3 sets of principles. You're taking this session talking about learning applications. So the 3 principles of universal design for learning are kind of the most common ones presented for faculty in creating learning environments. But it's important to consider the other 2 as well. So there are 7 principles of universal design, which we can apply to our physical environments, makerspace that maybe your students are using, or a computer lab, or some other hands-on type of experience for students. It's not just UDL there, it's about the physical space and how you design that. And then there are also 4 principles that help us design accessible technology. And they underpin the web content accessibility guidelines. And the basic guidelines are usually used by webmasters and others that are highly technical that may not be you, but some of them we can use as we design our courses. I'm just going to go through these really quickly because I think it's good to kind of see what they are, but we're not going to go into detail. And then I'm just going to give a summary statement of what that really boils down to as far as an instructor, what they need to know. But the principles of universal design talk about things like flexibility in use, equitable use. Everybody gets to use the product or environment you're designing. Making things simple and intuitive, which definitely applies to our classes. Many students with disabilities complain, I just get confused in these classes. I'm just not sure where I'm supposed to go next. And so simple practices in course design to make it clear what the student's supposed to do next is really important. Perceptible information. So the content that you're presenting can be accessed by, let's say, a person who is perceived by a person who's blind, and using a screen reader to read the text to them. But also students with dyslexia and other learning disabilities use text-to-speech software. So they too have to have access to the text. And that's the very thing that's kind of a problem, that is a problem with scanned in PDFs, is what the screen reader will present a student who's blind with is image. They don't see any of the text. They just see a picture. It's a picture of text. It's not really the text. And there are ways for the student to get access to skills that can help them do that. But just in simple design of your course, you can make sure that those students have access to the text, like any graphic image to include alternative text, because the screen reader is smart enough to grab that and speak it to a person who's blind. And it's easy to do as you're putting up those images in your course, but it's a lot of work if you go back and have to retrofit all of that. Tolerance for error you know, that you guide students if they make a mistake. If you have an assignment and a large assignment for projects I have in my class, when they're kind of open-ended, I always make sure they check with me at various points to share where they are, what they're doing for their project, and then what progress they've made, maybe the outline of what they're doing. I don't want to get the assignment at the end of the term that's totally, totally different than what I was trying to get them to do, and then try to figure out what to do with it. But that's an easy thing to do. In some cases, even grading them along the way. And so low physical effort in physical activities, unless you're teaching weightlifting. Size and space for approach and use. So that's computer labs where maybe you have adjustable tables and so forth for wheelchair users or people that are short or particularly tall in stature. Then your universal design for learning offers multiple means of representation and engagement and action and expression. The third set, IT, back to those web content accessibility guidelines. The foundation for all those guidelines is for everything that we put up on our websites to be perceivable. Notice that overlaps actually with both of the other sets of guidelines. Operable, people can actually operate the technology. It's not difficult, you know, and understandable and robust. And that's a case like where we want to have products that can be operated on any web browser. So our students can be using multiple web browsers and still do the exercise. That would be robust, where sometimes we have to use Chrome for this, or you have to, you know, that kind of thing is kind of frowned upon. So here's the nutshell part. So for you faculty, provide multiple ways for your participants to learn things, to demonstrate what they've learned. So in your assessments, have a variety of ways to assess and to engage with each other and with you. In my syllabus, when I have the part way at the top of my syllabus where I say, I'm happy to meet with you anytime one-on-one. And we can meet by using Zoom or Skype or the bulletin board system within the learning management system, or email, or some technology of your choice. The key here is I give them choice. I like to meet by Zoom. That's what I like. That's my preference. But it's not about me, really. It's about them. And there are some students that choose email. And my guess is, I don't have to ask them. My guess is it's students that maybe have a speech disability. They might just be just uncomfortable in interacting with me as a professor. They might have English as not their first language, and worried about embarrassing themselves with their English speaking, where they want to use their spell checkers and stuff. I don't need to know. I just need to offer it to them that you have a choice in this. Sometimes we don't give them a choice, but sometimes we can, and this is an easy one. Ensure that all the technologies, the facilities, the services, the resources, the strategies are accessible to individuals with a wide variety of disabilities. So this is kind of the disability part, which is just one part of it. Basic accessibility usually is referring to students with disabilities. That's an important group because just simply they're an important group. They're our students. It's also important that many times when you make things accessible to a student with a disability, you make it accessible to other people as well. The captions on video idea, if you have accurate captions, lots of people benefit from them. So it's not a bad idea. Particularly, sometimes people say, well, why do you focus, Cheryl, and your advice kind of on screen readers? Because there's so few students who are blind. Well, if I focus on screen readers, if you can make your course accessible, fully accessible to a student who is blind, you've picked up a lot of the other things you need to do for students with dyslexia, for students who have executive function issues or other issues. You can benefit them as well. So if we put all of these principles together, we can apply them to instruction, to services, to information technology, to physical spaces. On the image on the screen now, I talk about some of the categories of things that you would consider. What's important for this talk today is the one on instruction. And so the categories that I've selected are class climate. How do you make people feel welcome in your wording and things, assignments that you give, activities that you're hosting? How does it apply to interaction? How does it apply to physical environments and products? Delivery methods, the methods that you're using, information resources and technology, to the feedback you're giving your participants in your class, to the assessment. And the last item on that list is accommodations, because I always consider accommodations is a part of universal design. You as a faculty member should be aware of types of accommodations students get. And so just so you know how to respond to things and to think about things like, sometimes faculty say, well, you say not to use PDFs, Cheryl, but I'm linking to tons of them in articles I want my students to read. And I'll say, well, think about if you can Google that article, sometimes you could find an accessible version and use that. An alternative, though, to think about this is make sure you don't create any additional PDFs that are inaccessible. That's the first place to start. But then also think about the implications for a student that needs them to be redesign some of those articles. And so you know that they're going to have to be retrofitted. It might even consult with disability services that they might be able to do some proactively for you. I don't know. But anyway, it's something to think about, something to know that a student is going to need accommodations in some cases. Also, for you guys to just tuck away and consider a little bit is universal design and disability related content can be included in your classes. We at the university teach web design classes. Now, I can't say it's always the case, but many of them from the beginning talk about accessible web design. Bring in the web content accessibility guidelines right along with other standards of web design. But you can look computer science or engineering. Imagine if we created engineers that knew how to design inclusive products that are accessible, particularly to people with disabilities. The built environment, architecture, they've been fairly early to adopt some accessibility things because there are standards in physical construction that have to do with access. And communication, social work, education, all of those could benefit. So that's the framework of universal design applied to everything in higher education. And so it has all of these different characteristics. And then you could also create it as a foundation, use it as a foundation for an inclusive campus. At the end of the book that I wrote, I present this framework of universal design in higher education, and then talk about how it can create actually a model for inclusion. Because just the idea of universal design is a paradigm. It's a way to think about things. I like to think that our faculty would think about inclusion all along as they develop their course and as they're teaching their course, but also that we do that campus-wide, particularly in this day of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, our DEI efforts around these issues. And now the federal workforce policy now includes DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I was one that thought, well, accessibility is kind of implied by DEI, but it isn't for a lot of people. So I kind of like that A on the end. Anyway, I'm trying to get my campus to add the A onto the end of that, by the way. So what did we do? We did this in the IT. Remember, I'm in charge of accessible IT. And so for my group, we went through this process in developing our services. What we looked at first, or along the way, actually, is the vision of our vision. What are we looking for? Even in just focusing on IT, we're looking for an inclusive campus where everyone feels welcome, everyone can access whatever we're offering, including IT and so forth. But it's broader than just thinking about the technical specifications of web content accessibility guidelines. It's a bigger thought. It's a universal design sort of thought. And then for values, I looked at the University of Washington website, the president's site, the diversity website, whatever. What are those folks saying? Well, it was really easy to pull out values that are particularly related to this. You can do the same on your campus if it interests you. We have a value of diversity. We have a value of equity, a value of inclusion, and in everything that we do, compliance. We have to comply with a lot of things. And so complying with the ADA isn't some special thing. It's just what we do at universities. And the ADA kind of provides us a kind of a low level of guidance on making things accessible. It's not like it's just the sort of a bottom line we have to comply, but it's important to comply. You can't doubt that. And then we put the framework in there. So what is the framework? Well, the framework is what I just presented today, the Universal Design Higher Education Framework, where we talk about the scope of what we're doing, everybody and everything. So all the students, all the characteristics of students on campus, and might be in the future, and all the things we do at the University of Washington. We adopted the definition of universal design. There are others. If you want to choose another, there are plenty to choose from. We adopted the principles, the 3 sets of principles, because all of them apply to IT, online learning. We need to use the UDL principles. We don't just look at WCAG. We have computing spaces on campus where the original universal design principles play a role. And then we use the guidelines. All three sets of principles have well-established guidelines, and we just use those guidelines. We're not creating our own. And then the procedures, again, there are a lot of procedures that have been developed under all 3 sets of guidelines. And so we can adopt promising practices at least, but sometimes even proven practices, and especially in the area of architecture. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then we have, processes. And the primary one is to think inclusively, think broadly in the design of all these different things, rather than wait till the end and provide accommodations. Listens to the voices of all of our students, including those that are in marginalized groups, like students with disabilities. Then we developed our practices. That could be a whole day. We talk about that, but we looked at the stakeholder roles and the funding and the policies, the guidelines, and principles, procedures, our training, support. And what you find in this particular area of applying to instruction is the roles are changing. And so it's hard for faculty. You're asking them to change their role. Their mindset was maybe, oh yeah, we have a great office on our campus. I know Cynthia over there. She'll just take care of this. She takes care of our students with disabilities. That's one mindset. That's kind of relieving. It's not my problem. We all feel kind of good and say, oh, lucky I don't have to do that. But we're saying, well, wait a minute. You have a role, and maybe you're not doing as much as you could do. You don't have to do everything here. Universal design is incremental, but maybe you could work on that introductory video right now and get it captioned. Figure out how to do that. So we think about what we're doing now and what is our goal in the perfect campus, and how can we work incrementally toward that vision. And then we do some measurement of our websites, on campus, of our videos that are hosted by the university on YouTube, how are they captioned and so forth. And we take steps to reach these people and make things more inclusive. And then we look at the impact, and we compare the impact with way back to values. What suggested impact, about our diversity, goals, about our equity, about our inclusion, about compliance. And then every year we kind of pat ourselves on the back because we can say we're moving closer to that, really supporting all of those areas. So that is where I think is a good place to end up. But this framework, as I mentioned, is a good place to start. So I hope you can conclude, as I do, that universal design is a lot of things. It's an attitude. It's an attitude about valuing everyone, to be happy you have diversity in your class of all sorts, to be thrilled that, oh, I have a blind student in my art history class. I have never thought about how a blind person would react to art. This is going to be really fascinating. I'd like to have people think that way. And then it's a process. It values diversity. It values equity. It values inclusion. It promotes best practices. It does not lower standards. It's proactive, can be implemented incrementally, is for the benefit of everyone, and minimizes the need for accommodation. And so who wouldn't be for that? If I was selling that, I think you'd all buy it right now. So we have a lot of resources. There's a one called UDL on campus that maybe you've bumped into, and it takes those UDL principles and talks about how to apply them on a post-secondary campus. We have the Center on Universal Design and Education, which also promotes UDL, but more broadly, these other UDL principles. On that website, you'll find a framework for inclusive practices in higher education that goes into some detail about what I just presented today. And we have a document that's on equal access, universal design of instruction, which gives you a whole set of practices that go with that list of areas to think about, like class climate. There are probably 4 or 5 things. What can you do to improve your class climate? And goes on and on and on, and points them, matches each one of those suggestions to one of these or more of these universal design principles. And there's a good one for online instruction, which is called 20 Tips for Teaching an Accessible Online Course, that really promotes universal design. I use accessible here because that's kind of more, it makes more sense to people that don't know. I'm going to tell them about universal design. I would encourage you also to look at our knowledge base. We have hundreds of articles that are questions and answers and promising practices and case studies. And you can contribute to it. You can contribute a promising practice, or you can say, hey, Cheryl, why didn't you answer this question? And I will put my staff on it. We'll answer that question and it'll be up in the knowledge base in no time. So you can contribute to that effort. So it's time for Q&A if we have any time, or to move on to something else.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. This was excellent. You have shared with us a lot of information. It's so helpful. And as we were talking yesterday, we are all in this continuum of knowledge and comfort level. So we are in the process of finding entry points on how to relate this to our particular courses and syllabi. I would love to open up to if there are any questions for Cheryl.
Cheryl, could you stop sharing your screen so everyone can see each other?
So my first question actually is, could we have a copy of the presentation?
Absolutely.
That you should share. Okay, wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Great. Who would like to go? Please unmute yourself and let's have a conversation.
I can start. Pick two things that really stood out to me, or three. One was, I love how you say that we can have materials that are born accessible. They don't have to become accessible later in their lives. That was a great metaphor. This idea of thinking about an ability focus rather than a disability focus. So like, what are the many abilities that students in my class bring? And then the other one that I think is a concern of some faculty is just this idea that universal design does not lower standards, right? That I think a lot of us have really ingrained, or we've been socialized to think that particular ways of learning or testing or X, Y, or Z are more valuable than others. And so I think that's just a really important point, that UDL does not lower standards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also appreciated how you share with us the fact that we have with us today, Cheryl. I'm looking to find Catherine. Duffy, that goes by Catherine Duffy, that goes by Duffy, and Jessica Holdren is also here with us, and they run our disability support services. So it was wonderful, and we are going to continue the conversation with them as well when you leave. But to say, yeah, it's wonderful to have a disability support service or network, but it's our shared responsibility as instructors. We need to also do our share, to think ahead, to plan inclusively, to design our courses, keeping the principles of universal design, etc. And partner with them and with our students, of course, to ask for questions when we don't know. But because we do have an office, it doesn't mean that it's not our responsibility to ensure that our students are included.
Yes, I also appreciate that you hit on some of the major issues that we do see, like the captions of videos being accurate and PDF accessibility, the scanned PDFs. It happens a lot. And as you mentioned, it's quite difficult to remediate rather than just try to find the accessible version of it somewhere else. So I really appreciate that. We do also have Blackboard Ally.
Mm-hmm.
It's integrated into our campus system. So that is a tool for faculty to kind of check for accessibility issues in your campus courses. And it will walk you through steps on how to remediate some of that too.
Yeah, and we have LA as well. We actually use it with Canvas. It can be used with any learning management system. It's great, and it's kind of has a little game sort of attitude. So we find people are now in like receptions will come to me and say, hey, you know, I want to get my score up, but it keeps telling me this PDF is not accessible. What do I need to do? It's like, yes, they perceive of that problem. It doesn't catch everything, but it catches enough for people to show interest, and they have to take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes I will tell faculty, well, if you really are really connected to your PDF, all right, okay, you don't want to give it up. You want your syllabus there. You're thinking of somehow locking down your syllabus. I've taught many times, I don't think anybody's going to steal my syllabus. And if the students modify it, that's their problem. You know, it's like, anyway, I want them to modify it because I want them to edit it so they can take out the things not important and focus on maybe the timeline and add some details, little notes to self and so forth. And so I'll tell them, okay, you want your PDF? We actually use PDF on our Do It website. We just don't use it for the primary source of information. You go to our website to a document like the ones I referred to you today, and you'll see an HTML version that is perfectly accessible. That's the most accessible way you can make a document accessible. Okay, then you'll notice there's a link to the PDF. And the reason, why do we have PDFs? Well, I like PDFs because it's when I go to on-site conferences. Remember in the old days when we actually met each other in person? I like to have a handout. I know that handout's not accessible to everyone in the room probably, and I'm giving them the URL, and so they can access it, but I like a nice pretty printed copy. But you make it the secondary source, just like that building. The primary thing you run into is the HTML version, and then it's like, oh yeah, by the way, you can get a PDF if you want it. And so we'd have to shame people into not using them. Just don't use it as your primary source of information. And so that's that. You know, you don't have to give them up totally. Although I have in my course, I don't use them, but.
Was someone going to say something? I was going to say, it's been so wonderful to have you here, Cheryl. And I think I'm always amazed at how much how we hear things differently when someone from the outside says them than how we hear them when people within our own institution say them. So I'm especially glad to have you confirming many of the things that that we hear from our colleagues, and also amplifying them and adding your own expertise and experience to them. So thank you so much.
And there was some chat activity private saying, oh, everyone should benefit from hearing Cheryl. So maybe we have an opportunity to offer more of a campus-wide second time with more time focused on what you have to say. We apologize. I know it felt a little rushed.